How's it going, PD team? Welcome to part 2 of making a fully procedural wood shader. If you haven't watched part 1, then I highly encourage you to do so, as the first half is critical. This tutorial was recorded months ago, and my process has somewhat changed. It's going to be slightly longer than my current content, but the process is more advanced and requires deeper explanation. So bear with me on this one. Don't worry, there are plenty of tips and gems along the way. With that being said, grab a coffee, a tea, or a snack, and let's dive in. Okay, so here's where we left off in the last version. You want your project file as close to the one that I created, so I've linked this starting off point in the video description. So go ahead and download that now if you've watched part 1. Okay, so just as an overview, basically what we've got is we've got this layer here, and it's stacking all these materials at different sizes, building up a look. And then what we're doing is we're looping it 3 times to create 3 bands of grains. So we'll have a large grain, a medium grain, and a small grain. And if I solo this individual, you can see we've got, let's disable these warps. Okay, so you can see here, we've got this first round, which is just looping once and creating these loops here. And then if I add another solo to the next layer, you can see we're doubling it up. And now we're getting a thick band where the original was. And then in between these gaps, we're feeding that back into itself and looping it again. And then we've got one more round of loops, so it feeds into this multiply node in the mod node again and doubles it up. And then what we're doing here is these ones here are just subtly warping by adding slight bits of noise. So you can see here's a noise, here's a noise, here's a noise, and here's a grain. And what's happening is if I just add this in, let me solo this last one here. You can see we're adding just a little bit of a gradient over the top, and it's just warping these slightly. And the values are really, really low. And then this one's disrupting, and we could probably go less on this one. So let's bring that down to 0.1. There we go. So now you can see we got coming from layer number 2, which is this, is being overlaid at a really small level, is just warping the material. Then after we do that, we stack these up into this color layer. I'm going to rename this grayscale or gray. And from there, we're feeding in a ramp node. So this ramp node is coloring it. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a red color. And what I do is I recolor the nodes that I'm going to be editing in the controller in red. So this is our gradient that's remapping that to this gradient right here. And this is something that you can adjust to your liking. Then what we did is we added another color layer where we're going to stack more effects from over here. We're going to pull from it and stack in here. And what that's going to allow us to do is add other colors. We also added this grain in here. I'm going to disable this and delete it and turn it off because we're not going to be using this for now because we're going to come at it with a different approach. So here's what we got so far. So this looks great from far away, but if we were to do a tight detailed shot, which our goal with this shader is to be able to use it in like every capacity. And one of those things is if we were to do like a wood carving or whatever, and we were to come close, you'll start to see that it's just vector noise and it falls apart. So maybe about here is the closest we'll want to be to this shader. And so what we can do is we can add more detail. So we'll add those fine grains. So I'll get close here. What we can do is on the grayscale here, we can add another layer, and I'm going to add a mask in here. And what this will allow us to do is you can see it took over because it's filling it with black. So you can see if I move this white, it brings it up to the lighter gray. So what we'll do is we'll add a noise. And when I'm doing grains, I like to use the wavy turbulence, and it looks like this. And what we can do is we can scale this to like 10 on the X. So it goes lengthwise. And you can see we get this nice wood-like material. So what we'll do is we'll bring this down to like say 20. So we get smaller details. Actually, let's go down to 1 because we're doing grains. And the smaller you go with this, the more you want the stretching. So let's do something like 50. And there we go. And now what we'll do is we'll feed this, call this grain. You fed this into the mask. And now what we can do is you can see it's knocking out large portions of our material. So we'll solo this, unsolo it so we can see what's going on. You can see we're getting these nice grains and striations, but it's taken out too much. So what we can do is, remember, white is going to be opaque and transparent will be black. So if I come in here and on the contrast of the material here, the noise, set it to 0.9, what we get is we get more contrast black and whites. And then what we can do is you can use the brightness to reveal and hide bits and pieces that we want to show. So I'll put this to -0.2, looks pretty good, something about there. And now if I unsolo, you can see we now have little striations within our material. And so if I wanted to, I can duplicate this, do another 4 here to number 5, go into the mask, do this, and then take and change the value here. And you can see we have more knockouts. And maybe these ones are not as long. So maybe we'll go to 25. Let's do 15. Now we have more. And so I can move this slider to reveal or take away those cutouts. And now if I want to take a different part, I'll put it back to -0.2. Now if I want, I can change this from black to white or anything in between. So I can take, let's open this up. I can then fine tune it by moving this grayscale value up and down to get different parts of that gradient. So I'm going to leave this on white. So we're taking the brightest of this gradient here and the darkest of the gradient. So this first one is taking from here. This one here is taking from this part. And now we've kind of added more detail so we can get a little bit closer to it and it not look like vector. See that? Much better. So there we go. Now, one other thing we can do is if we want more warping to happen, we can actually add included noise into this input value where we're looping it. So right now we're looping this second one 5 times. So you'll see 5 rings in there. If I look at this one, we're also linking it up and doing 5. Our base one is set to 10. So if we want to add warping to this, we can. So there's a couple ways we can do this. We can adjust it using the noise like we did here with the brightness and contrast, or we can use a change range. So we're going to use the float change range because our output, we want to be an individual even number. So we want increments. This is a float value. So what we'll do is we'll come in here and we'll put this to 10, the max, because that's what our value is. And I'll also set the minimum to 10 as well. So if I plug this in, nothing will happen. Let's go. Yeah, we'll go into the first one. It'll be easier to see. And then what we'll do is we'll add a noise, and I'll also set this to a length of 10. So we get some longer noise. We'll scale this down. Let's do 50, and I'll just change the seed number just to make sure we don't have the same value in any of these here. And I'll plug it in. And now what's cool is in this change range, I can start reducing this value, and you can see it's already warping. So if I come in here and keep dropping it, so we don't need much. So we can put a slider right here for that input range or output range to here to be somewhere between 5. Let's try 5 and see what that gives us. It gives us wild distortions, too much. So close to 10 is where you want to be. So I'll address how to make a controller with this value in a second, later in the video, but there we go. So that's distortion. That'll help augment and warp your lines even more. And you can do that for the detailed one. We don't really need it, but if you make something and you're not using all these nodes here to warp it, you can always come in here to these loops and add inputs into the multiply node in this value. And just remember, you don't want to feed the noise directly into the input of the multiply node because these values are 0 and 1. And so we're augmenting that 0 and 1 to be remapped to these bigger numbers. Okay, so we covered adding tighter grains and we covered the augmentation, and things are looking pretty good so far. So I'm going to go back over here to this change range and just bring this to 9 so we don't have so much warping. And if you want tighter warps, it's very easy. We just reduce this number to like 25 and now we have tighter warps. Let's do 9.5. There we go. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is adding more control to the color. So you might not want to come in and change this ramp and just have an offset slider. So what we can do is we can drag this over and we can add a color correct node, connect it, and put that right before the color input. So now what we can do is we can add saturation and do all sorts of stuff. So if we come in here to this and we add more grains that are colored, we can then offset them using the color correct node. So I'll give that a red color. There we go. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is let's get our reflections correct. We have nothing plugged into the roughness channel. So to do that, let's zoom out so we can see what's going on. We've got the gray layer, which is our grayscale. It builds up the look. We want to take this and augment the roughness amount. So what we'll do is we'll come in here and we'll do a change range. Let's use a standard change range. And let's also do a invert. And the reason we want to invert this is we want to invert these black and white values. So we'll plug in here. And the reason being is you're going to want the areas that are tighter like this. You actually want them to be more blurry, and these bigger areas that are raised to be shinier. So that's what this is going to do, is it's going to invert it. So you can see now if I solo that, you can see it's just inverting the value. Okay. And then what this is going to do, this change range is going to allow us to augment the reflection amounts. So we'll come in here and we'll just say roughness, boom, plug that in, call it roughness. And the 0 is going to be the least blurriest spot within the material, and 1 is ultra rough. So let's plug this in and say 0.1, and the maximum can be 0.35. And then what we can do is we can put sliders for these two to let the user change the roughness amount. So we'll come in here and rotate it to where we got the roughness visible in the reflection. And then we can take these and we can put this to 0, and you can see the highlights in the brighter areas are now shinier. So if I set this to 0.25, you can see we get sharper edges on that reflection. So I'll put this back to 3.5, and I'm going to leave this at 0 so we get a shinier highlight. The next thing we can do is we can add a value, call this rough min max. Select both of these, basic, make it red, and we'll put for the first one 0.1 and this one 0.35. Plug it into the input range and input range on the min and the max. And there we go. Now we have two controllers for the roughness amount. So I'll take these, drag these up to the top. The next thing what we want to do is we want to see the ability to add a coat of varnish to this. So I'm going to come in here to layer number 7 of my color changing section. And I'm going to just rename this like color. And we'll go to layer 7 and we'll command click on here and we'll command click on here. So we have a mask for both. And you can see already we get a cool effect where it looks like piano lacquer because it's set to black, which is pretty cool. And now what we can do is we can move the slider down and back and forth to get a value that kind of looks cool. We can also add a brown color to this, like a stain, a dark wood stain. And this will mimic the effects of a varnish, which is pretty cool. So now that we've done that, we can take and add another value. I'm just going to steal one of these values and I'll call this varnish amount and we'll drag it into number 7. Now we have a slider for the amount and then we'll do another one for varnish color. We'll change the float to color, pick a lacquer color. There we go. So now we have a slider for that. So you can see at 100, it's fully taken over. We can dial it back and there we go. So there's our varnish control. The next thing we want to add is we want to add some holes to the wood grain where a tree would have a branch coming out. It usually has a darker spot. So let's go to our varnish amount and bring this to 0. So if I zoom out, you can see there should be one right in the middle here, maybe right here, one starting to show up here. So let's make one of those. So we'll add another layer. And the way this works is we're going to steal from all the way back here. So let's pull from this one here. If I solo this, you can see we get these dark striations and we can take those and clamp those. So let's open this up so we can pull from it and we're going to just drag it over into layer number 6. I'm going to clean things up. So I'm going to do command or control shift together. It allows us to add a knot. And then what we can do is I can come in here and add a ramp, pick the ramp, drag it over the line. It adds it in, contrast knot. And then what we can do is we can solo it so we can see what we're doing here. We can just crunch this till we get something that looks good. There it goes. Turn on number 6 and we'll set it to multiply. And there's our knot. Now, if you want your knot to be darker and not use the gradient, like have your own control for it, instead of putting it in this gray one, we can actually come in here and add it to number 6. Set this to multiply. We'll actually add it into number 6 here. And we'll do, instead of doing it into the color, we're going to do it into the mask and we'll do an invert. We'll turn off number 6. And now what we can do is we can change this color to a brown. So now you can do your own color for that knot. So it can be its own deal. We'll come in here and add a little bit more contrast to it. There we go. And so if you want to change the scale of this knot, you just move these two gradients. Like that. And you can see we can scale it, make it bigger or smaller. I'm going to leave it something like that. You want to make sure that you name your nodes because when we come in here and add controllers to this, it makes it much easier trying to figure out what you're doing at that moment. Because things, once you get decent at this, you'll do stuff quickly and you will turn into a spider web of nonsense if you don't name your stuff. So there we go. There's the knot. And that knot is feeling a little bit bright for me and saturated. There we go. So you got 2 ways you can add the knot. If that was too much, there's another way you could do the knot. You can go back in and have it go to number 6 again. And instead of doing number 6 here, we'll turn this off. What you can do is we're back to where we were and enable number 6. And so there's our knot again. And what you can do is you can come into the ramp of your color here and just move it over just slightly. And then this part will saturate and darken. And you can see it does this, but the areas in here are getting exposed. So there's kind of a couple ways you can do this. I think having knot control, doing it this way is probably the better route to go with. And then you can do a controller for that. So let's lighten this up, desaturate it. There we go. So that's that. There's getting the knot in there. Let's take a look and see how we're looking from far away. Looking decent. We can also change our knot to be a different blending mode. So I'll click once and we'll just flick through these. So subtract is kind of interesting, kind of dark. I think multiply is looking the best. There we go. Now what we can do is instead of using just this individual one, we've got some masking happening. So we can actually steal from this here and try this out and see if it gets us better results. Yeah, much better results because we had some masking issue with the line. The seam here wasn't holding up. So there's that. Now, the last step that I want to discuss is weathering. And when we consider weathering, we're not going to go crazy with the weathering on this, like actually have, vertical masks and all that. I'm going to save that for a different video tutorial. So what we're going to do is we're going to just use the simple contrast, the concave and convex nodes to accomplish that, to get crevasses or crevices, however you like to say it. So in order to illustrate this properly, I'm going to bring over a model to help us do that we're going to eventually throw away and delete from the scene, just for temporary use. Here I'm with a 3D scan model that I got off the interwebs. It's a Chinese dragon wood sculpture. I think it was metal. Not sure what material it is, maybe stone. But I love this model. It looks great for dusting materials. And what we want to consider is when you look at aged wood, you get areas that get sun bleached, like in this area, will get more exposed to weathering and touching and stuff. So it'll be lighter wood. And then areas down here in the crevices will be darker and take out light. So there'll be more darker wood. Maybe there's even like green in there from wood rot. That's as far as you can take it as far as you want, especially areas like in here in this little crevice. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to add this to the color node right here. This is getting kind of messy here. Let's move these over. There we go. So I'm going to add these. The varnish you can see we have set to the last one, and then the knots here. I'm going to do it on number 5 and 4. So I'm going to start with the crevices first, and then the brighter areas I'll do on number 5. What we want to do is we want to first start off with a curvature, and we'll plug it into number 4, and we'll rename this concave. And we're adding it into the color. We want to actually bring that into the mask. So we'll drag this into the mask, and we'll set the color of it to be a brownish color, somewhere around there. And I'll solo it. And you can see when I zoom in here, we're affecting the outer polygons. We want to do the inner. So we'll go to the convex and go to concave. So that does the inner. And then you'll see these polygons showing up. So I'm going to set this to 1.5 so they're bigger, and that will soften it. We also want to introduce a little bit of contrast to get our mask looking a little bit better. So I'll come in here to the contrast and just bring this up. So I'll put it to something like 2, and then we'll turn off the solo. And now you can see we're getting a nice darkening in these corners, right? And we can also come in here and change the blending mode so we can actually brighten this up if we want. And then try some of the other blending modes. So let's try hard light. And then soft light will be softer. Burn is actually looking pretty nice. And we can have a user select that if we wanted. So you can see we get a nice effect with burn. If we bring up the brightness value, it kind of does this interesting texture. I'm going to go darker with it and leave it something like that. Now we want to do the opposite for the high points. So I'm going to take and duplicate this concave, convex, and we'll go into number 5 here, and we'll do the mask, remember? And I'll make this white for now. And we'll set the mask input on number 5 here. And check our values here. So we want to do the opposite. We're showing too much white in here. So what we can do is we can experiment with the min value to kind of clamp that. So it's just the ends. And there you go. And now you can see we have light weathering. I don't want this to look too weathered, so I'm going to be kind of minimal with it because I want to be able to use this for flooring and whatnot. So you can see we get some end corners that are lightened and then the inner parts that are kind of darkened. And that's kind of the extent I want to take it for this round. Now you're more than welcome to add more craziness to this material, but I feel like that's good enough for now. So here's before and now after. So not a big difference, but enough to show some kind of wear on the material. Okay, so next I'm going to delete this dragon because we do not need it anymore. And you can see if I go here to the edge, we get a nice little highlight right here. It's kind of hard to see probably, but there is a lightening on the edges, which is what we want to show kind of a light wear and tear. The next thing I want to do is I want to set up controllers on this so I can reuse this on other projects. So I'm going to turn off my render here and minimize the viewport, command click, and I'm just going to look at the whole interface here. So I like starting off with most important and used controls and biggest, most likely to change. So the first one is setting the material scale. So if I come in here to the noise large, you can see we have the value set to 500. So I want to use that as my prime value. So I'll come in here and say value, make it red, and I'm going to take this and just move it up top here and then just command drag it. So I'll set this value to a integer. We'll set it to 500. So that's our base. So we'll add the scale in here by command clicking the dot, not the keyframe, but the dot. Drag this into here. And let's go ahead and separate these a little bit more because we're going to be changing a lot of these. Go down here. So overall scale looks good. And we'll open this up and we'll add this one. And you can see the scale is set to 250, which tells us it's half. So what we can do is we can take and add a multiply node, and we drag in our value into the first slot, and we know we want to do half, so that's 0.5. And now we'll add that to the overall scale. So now we have half. We'll go to our mask here. We're at 500. So I'll set the mask to 500. Command Shift click to get a node. The warping set to 50. So we'll take our multiply node and we'll set this to 0.1, which is 10%. There's that. And then this small one here, and this guy here, we're going to do the warping, small and large and grain, and that's set to 20. So what we do is we can take 20 and divide it by 500, which gives us 0.04. So I'm going to come in here and do 0.04. Add this in. And our grain is 0.2. I'm going to leave that. So that's 2. So if I take 2 divided by 500, 0.004. So I could do that. 0.004. There we go. So now we got the scale set up. So now if I want to change the scale of the whole shader, I can do that right here. So let's see here. We're going to leave these grain ones. They're so small that it's fine. And I think that's all the noises. Oh, and we got one right here. So again, this one's set to 25. So that's 0.05. And I think I have a 0.05 here. I don't have a 0.05. So I'll take this 0.05, drag this over, do this scale, drag this into here. There we go. Okay, so there we go. We got the noises all set up on scale. The next thing I want to do is I want to be able to do a checkbox on some of these properties. And the main one that I want to do is the actual wood knot. So I'll come in here to this float value, duplicate it, holding command, change this to bool. So I now have a checkbox, and we'll go to the knot here. You can see it goes down to number 6 here. So we'll go here and we'll expose this checkbox here, plug it in to here, and I'll put not vis. There we go. So now we have the knot visibility to check on and off if we want. Boink, boink. The other thing we want to do is we want to be able to control how many rings are in here. So we can see we have that one's controlled by the max range here, and this guy here. And this one's 5 and this one's 5. So let's go ahead and take this float value, change it to an integer, which is a whole number. And we'll set this to 5. And we'll duplicate this and make another one set to 5. And we'll call this medium rings, small rings. So we'll plug that into here, plug this one into here, and there we go. So there's the rings. And this next one is rather tricky because we've got a change range. And what we want to do is we want to be able to say, take one of these and say 10. But you notice this one here is subtracting 0.5. So what we can do is we can take and add a change range. Let's move this up. Actually, we'll move it here. And I'll call this large rings. And I'll set this to 10. And we'll plug that into the change range here of the max range here. That one's fine, but then this one we want to have a little bit lower, so 0.5. What we're going to do is we're going to take and add a sub, which is going to subtract from 10 a value of 0.5. And then we'll input it into the new min range. It's kind of hard to see, but we're going in these two values right here. So you can see it says sub and large. So now we've got a value here of 0.5 that it's going to be subtracting from it. Now you could also put a controller on this as well and say like how much distortion occurs. That's up to you, but I'm going to leave it at 0.5. The other thing we might want to do is we want to make these warpings available. And what we can do is we can go in the viewport and find our minimum and maximum values and do a slider. So we can say how much minimum and maximum warping. And to do that, what we'll do is we'll add a change range. Move it out here. Call this warp amount. And we'll add the first one. And we can see that the minimum we can set to, see how it says 0.01? We can set our minimum input to be 0.01. 0.005, so a little bit higher. Let's do 0.025, so that'd be the max value. And so now what we can do is when we move this input amount from 1 to 0, it's going to go between these two values. So what that means is we can convert the 1 and the 0 to be 0% to 100%. So we can plug this puppy in to the mask of number 2. We can come up here and take our float value over here, duplicate this, change this to float. We can move this value back and forth. And this will give us a max warping and a minimum warping. So 0 to 100. So 0 to 1 is a 0 to 100%. So I'll put it somewhere 0.5, 50% warping. There we go. So you can do that same thing for this one here. Take these two values, duplicate it. And we need to add number 3. So warp 1, warp 2. So now we can convert these sliders to percentages. So there's our warping. We've got our main scale. So I'll call this texture scale. And what else? We've got the ring amount, which is great. We've got the knot visibility. Oh, our knot color as well. So I'll come in here, drag a version below it, call that knot color. Knot is going to be number 4. I'm going to copy that color, so I'm going to disconnect it. Command C, Command V. Now I pasted number 4. Things get really messy if you're not careful and name your layers, your nodes. There we go. And we've got the color correct node for offsetting the colors if you want. And there we go. That's it for this tutorial. If you want to see part 3, post in the comment section and like this video to show your support. In part 3, I will show you how to convert the setup into a wood shader node preset and add a user interface. That's it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more content. Thanks for your support.